Shay Cody. Zoom keeps interrupting me. Shay is the current president of the Irish Labour History Society, but he's a long and distinguished career as a trade union leader, as indeed did Tom Johnson before him, about whom he's going to speak. So, Shay, I can't actually see you, so I think somebody's camera is blocking, and I would like you to be visible at least in the corner while you're moving your slides on. But with no further ado, I'll leave you to start your talk this afternoon, which is being recorded, by the way.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much, Mary, for the introduction, and thanks very much for all your help in hosting this and previous events. I'm going to, I suppose, go through the headline events of Tom Johnson's career, and then maybe try to give a bit of a flavour of Tom through some of his speeches and writings, and then we'll have some time for questions and comments at the end. So Tom Johnson, as you see from this screen, was born in 1872. He was born in Liverpool. And interestingly, he was born a short walk away from where James Larkin was born 2 years later. And Larkin would have seen himself as Liverpool Irish, and Johnson quipped that he came from Liverpool English stock. Johnson's mother died when he was age 6, so he was reared by his father. They had been members of the Church of England when Tom's mother was alive, but they migrated to nonconformist chapels and subsequently would have been attenders at the Unitarian chapel in Liverpool. And over time, Tom ceased to adhere to any church. The interesting thing about that Unitarian chapel in Liverpool was it was a source of a reading and study group, which was very socialistic in its orientation, and that would have influenced the young Tom. As was typical of the time, he left school at a very early age. In his case, he left school at age 12, securing jobs such as an office boy or an office runner. But by his early 20s, he had climbed a ladder to become a commercial representative. And in the early 20s, he was working with a firm that was based jointly in Liverpool and Kinsale in Ireland, which brought him for several months of the year to Ireland. He would have had no immediate family connection with Ireland otherwise. And in Kinsale, he met and married Tregay from Cornwall, creating a lifelong personal and political relationship. And just with regard to Mary, the other half of the recently published book by the Labour History Society includes Charlie Callan's extensive account of the lifetimes, politics and activities of Mary. As a couple, they had one son, Fred, who later became quite a prominent actor, both of stage in the Abbey and screen in a number of Hollywood films. And if you look up IMDb, you'll find a list of various things that Tom was involved with. Let me see, can I make this happen? Okay, so over time, Tom ended up with a firm called Dáil and Hewitt, of which we will hear some more. They were a veterinary medicine and animal feeds merchants, and they were based in Belfast. And that commenced a long-term residence for Tom and Mary in Belfast. In Belfast, he joined the Shop Workers Union and became active on the Belfast Trades Council. And as well as that, he was active in the local cooperative societies, socialist organisations, and interestingly also in the Gaelic League and IRB circles, where he would have been certainly an acquaintance, if not a friend, of a number of prominent IRB people who subsequently ended up organisers of the 1916 Rising. Tom had early links with Larkin. In fact, his first meeting with Larkin took place with the Independent Labour Party in Liverpool. The Johnsons put Larkin up when he arrived unannounced, which I think is typical enough for an for a British Labour Party conference in Belfast, which was Larkin's first visit to Belfast. In addition, the Johnsons supported Connolly's return from America in 1910, and at the early period of Connolly's return to Ireland, the Johnsons put up a number of the Connolly children, and subsequently Mary ended up working with Connolly in Belfast as a kind of an office support worker for James Connolly, and their engagement and friendship lasted until 1916. Tom ran for a seat on Belfast Corporation in 1908 in a heavily Unionist area, and won 41% of the vote against the Unionist party opponent, indicating the latent strength of kind of labourism in Belfast at the time. Within the Irish Trade Union Congress, Tom became a delegate from the Shop Workers Union and worked with Connolly in opposing William Walker's backing for affiliation to the British Labour Party. And some of the records in the National Library indicate correspondence between the two of them about strategizing the best way to oppose Walker's position with regards to British Labour Party orientation for the Irish Trade Union Congress, as opposed to an Irish one. And Tom backed the 1912 motion that was moved by James Connolly, establishing an Irish Labour Party. He was deeply involved, as was Mary, in a fundraising role during the 1913 lockout. They travelled to the north of England, where they raised funds that was converted via the cooperative movement into the food ships that came to Dublin at the time. And Tom assisted with and sat in on meetings of the Dublin Trades Council, which was effectively the strike committee for the 1913 dispute. He became a member of the Irish Trade Union Congress executive in 1913. And the following year, interestingly, shared a Belfast platform with James Connolly backing Home Rule, which is a real kind of indication of how far politics travelled between then and 1916. And Tom was elected president of the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party, as it was titled at that stage, in 1914. Tom was not involved in the 1916 Rising. In fact, he had no knowledge of it pending. He was, in fact, in Wales as the Rising broke out, and heard of it first as he was trying to get a boat back to Dublin, and ended up having to travel a kind of a difficult route via Belfast to get back to Ireland. Interestingly, again, the National Library contains a personal diary he kept of the week, where he obviously saw the significance of the events and gave a kind of a first-hand account of, conversations with people and his attempts to get back to Dublin. An important point to make is that after the Rising, Johnson was one of the most senior, if not the most senior, surviving trade union and labour leader following the Rising. And he immediately took on a role of interacting with the military authorities with regard to the treatment of prisoners, pressing for the release of prisoners, pressing for compensation for workers and entities that had lost income or material, and also recovering trade union records that had been seized on a pretty widespread basis by the military authorities. One interesting point was he was authorized by the British authorities to take away bags and bags of records that had been taken from Liberty Hall on the basis that anything that wasn't a trade union record would be returned to the army. He contacted some Republicans to say that he had inadvertently got his hands on the records of the Sinn Féin Bank, which they copied out, and he kept his word by returning the originals to the British Army. Johnson is probably fairly well known for his 1916 presidential address, and I'll deal with this a little bit later on, but it was notable for its even-handed approach to 1916 and the war dead of the First World War. Sections of it dealt with the war, which he called the monstrous offspring of greed and tyranny, the danger of creditors seeking repayments afterwards leading to retrenchment. And he noted that the war allowed public control of transport and control of prices and rents, which had been long-term trade union demands, which they had been told were impossible. Now, this is an interesting and I think familiar photograph dating back to 1914, which is a photograph of the executive of the Trade Union Congress and Labour Party that was elected at the 1914 conference. Importantly, Johnson was the only person missing from that photograph. Now, as we go through it, on the extreme left-hand side, you can see James Connolly was obviously dead following the Rising. On the extreme right-hand side, Richard O'Carroll, who was the leader of the Labour Party and Dublin City Council, was also killed in the Rising. At the back, second from the left, William O'Brien was imprisoned following the Rising, even though he played no part in it. P.T. Daly equally played no part in the Rising, but was imprisoned. Larkin, I have the dotted the markings around him, was obviously gone from Ireland. He was in the United States, where he would remain for the following 7 years. And the last person, second from the right, is Michael O'Lahan, who was the leader of the Shop Workers Union. And Michael O'Lahan's health very, very quickly declined, and O'Lahan passed away at the end of the First World War, but was really out of circulation as an active trade unionist from 1916 onwards. So you can see from that executive how Johnson, who ironically wasn't in it, was kind of close to being one of the last men standing of that leadership cadre of the trade union and labour movement of the time. During the revolutionary years, and I just draw your attention when I say anti-conscription campaigns, because Johnson from a very early stage was involved in opposing conscription and indeed enlistment in the British Army from the very commencement of the war. And in fact, paid for a leaflet that he distributed on the margins of British Army barracks in the Belfast area, warning soldiers against them being used against organised workers, and in particular against miners who'd been involved in a number of disputes. Obviously the anti-conscription campaign in the South was mainly focused on the events of 1918, when the British campaign was very much on the back foot, and the desperation led to legislation being enacted that allowed for conscription across Ireland. And this led to a massive campaign, and in particular the general strike of April 1918 against it. The Mansion House Conference that kind of led to the kind of national movement against conscription in the southern counties involved Labour movement and Johnson. And one interesting insight into the significance of Johnson's role was an RIC sergeant called T.J. McElligott, in his witness statement, describes movements within the RIC to mutiny in the event of conscription being triggered. And he, on behalf of his colleagues, made contact with the Mansion House Committee. And Johnson was the person assigned to that very dangerous and obviously treasonous engagement with the RIC to see what they would do. Johnson, in his own view, took the view that if conscription was enacted, that despite all the talk and everything, the fight against conscription would fall on the shoulders of two movements, the volunteers and the trade union movement, on the grounds that they were the only national entities that were in a position to resist conscription. Johnson was centrally involved in the debates and decisions around the 1918 general election. And I suppose the first point to make is that Johnson originally favoured Labour participation in the 1918 general election. In fact, he proposed to the Congress executive that Labour would fight the election in mid-1918. I'm not going to stay too much on this particular issue. It might come up in discussion later on. But Johnson, in effect, found himself a general without any army, because it became very clear that despite the original decision of Labour to fight the election, most trade unions and most trade unionists opposed their participation in the election. And their original intention had been to fight 15 seats. That quickly disappeared back to the idea of fighting for 4 seats in Dublin. And even that collapsed as it became apparent that if Labour fought those seats, they would have been opposed by Sinn Féin and the Parliamentary Party. And in fact, the most enthusiastic backers of Labour participating in that election were actually Dublin Castle authorities, who saw it as a way of, I suppose, confusing the electoral battlefield. Having found himself in that position, Johnson led the retreat and spoke at the ITUC Labour Party conference that decided to withdraw from the election. It would be pretty well known that Johnson was a central drafter of the democratic programme, which I suppose was the social or socialistic adjunct to the Declaration of Independence by Dáil. I would certainly commend to you Pádraig Yates' detailed analysis of the programme in the publication by Saher, where Pádraig shows the original draft of Johnson and his colleagues and how it was amended and watered down generally by the Sinn Féin IRB people who felt it went too far. And that detailed analysis is certainly worth scrutinising. Johnson assisted the Dáil in the period from January 1919 onwards, initially by attending the International Socialist Conference in Bern, where they successfully pressed for independent representation for Ireland, and probably more significantly convinced the British Labour Party delegation to shift its previous policy position of being in favour of home rule for Ireland to a policy position of favouring self-determination for Ireland. And that was a very significant intervention that had quite significant implications over the following number of years. As well as attending Bern and securing that kind of independent platform for Ireland, Johnson was invited to and participated in a Dáil committee analysing the natural resources of Ireland, and participated in that until the Dáil was declared illegal and the work of that committee was wound up. He also continued his engagement on behalf of the Irish struggle with both the British Labour Party and indeed members of the British government, and reported back to Dáil and Sinn Féin and IRA leaders over the period. And again, his records in the National Library indicate regular engagements with Collins and Boland, Mulcahy and Rory O'Connor. Alongside all of that, Johnson played a significant role in a number of significant events during the revolutionary period. The Limerick, what is described now as the Limerick Soviet, or the Limerick dispute against militarization and the decision to put restrictions on the movement of workers, broke out pretty spontaneously, and Johnson was sent by the ITUC and Labour Party leadership to Limerick to assist with the dispute. It was said that a kind of a bizarre approach was taken by Johnson in Limerick of seeking to advocate that the workers would evacuate the city. But the records of the Congress show that that decision took place after Johnson had actually left to go to Limerick to assist with the workers. And interestingly, following the 2 weeks of that dispute, Johnson saw the significance of it being that workers could take control of a city, but he never saw a possibility of Limerick being developed into I suppose, a generalized strike, or an ability to kind of overturn the might of the British Army. He saw it as a limited dispute, and that was a view in the subsequent Congress debates that was shared by the leaders of the dispute in Limerick. Johnson was centrally involved in the general strike of 1920. That was in support of hunger strikers, mainly in Mountjoy prison. And he was involved in the conversations that led to the calling of that dispute at short notice. And an interesting, I suppose, consequence of that strike that led to the release of a significant number of Republican prisoners is the replenishing of IRA ranks by a lot of battle-hardened activists in and after April 1920. And the significance of that for the military campaign shouldn't be underestimated. Probably the most important role that was played by Johnson during this period was his role in the munitions dispute. And again, I won't go into too much detail on this because the munitions dispute has been covered in great detail by Peter Rigney's recent booklet, which I commend to those of you here and viewing. But the significance is that, in effect, the workers who were in dispute were mainly members of British unions. And I suppose officially, it was an unofficial dispute where workers took their suspension or dismissal without a subsequent all-out strike. This allowed the dispute to continue for a long period of time, greatly disrupting the British war effort. Johnson was central to raising a significant amount of money to support the suspended workers or dismissed workers. £120,000 was collected, which would be about £1.5 million in today's money. And again, a witness statement describes a doctor from Carrick-on-Suir bringing £2,000 in cash and being directed to the Labour Party offices in Abbey Street to pass it over to Johnson to support the dispute. That dispute, military historians have indicated severely disrupted the British war effort because they found it very, very difficult to move either armed troops or ammunition around the country, and were then sent to the road. And the British Army vehicles in Ireland were not at the top end of the range. And obviously the road system back then wasn't what it is now. And certainly a number of offensives that were anticipated during 1920 were delayed while that munitions dispute continued. By the end of the War of Independence, I suppose an important point to make, even if it's an obvious one, is Labour, despite their intimate involvement in the War of Independence, had no involvement at all in the treaty negotiations that were exclusively the property of Dáil and the Sinn Féin organisation. And from today's perspective, it's kind of unusual that even on a background basis, they wouldn't have used negotiators that both were familiar with some of the British authorities and in particular were well versed in the art of negotiation. But that's what it was. The outcome was the treaty, as you would know. Labour was officially neutral on the treaty, and in fact, that was pretty much held up across the board, with two notable exceptions. Larkin denounced the treaty vehemently from his prison cell in America, and Johnson quietly advocated in favour of the treaty, but not in public at the time. In April 1922, the Labour movement was extremely concerned at the split that was taking place in the Sinn Féin and IRA ranks, and called a general strike in 1922 against militarization. And Johnson, you can see the photograph there, spoke to 30,000 people in O'Connell Street in an attempt to head off the Civil War. In the interval between that strike and the commencement of the Civil War, there was the 1922 general election, and Labour won 17 seats. Now, there's a number of interesting, I suppose, background points around that. First of all, there were significant acts of intimidation to seek to prevent candidates from outside of the Sinn Féin family participating in that election. In fact, there was an interesting aside in the Dáil at one stage by Dan Morrissey, who in the 20s was a Labour Party TD, against Dan Breen. Dan Breen had obviously made some comment about Dan Morrissey, and Dan Morrissey said the last time he had an engagement with Dan Breen was when Dan Breen held a gun to his head in 1922, trying to get him to withdraw from the general election of that year. An interesting point about that election is that the pro-treaty forces secured 39% of the vote. The anti-treaty forces had 22% of the vote. Labour had 21% of the vote, Farmers 8% and Independents 8%. Now, so that kind of indicates that the anti-treaty and Labour had almost identical votes, but there were a large number of uncontested seats, and 17 of them went to pro-treaty forces, 16 went to anti-treaty, 4 went to independents, and obviously none of them were going to the Labour Party. And a lot of the uncontested seats indicated cases of intimidation. Labour, including Johnson and indeed Mary, his wife, acted as honest brokers both before and during the Civil War. Notwithstanding receiving initial anti-treaty threats both before and at the commencement of the Civil War. And I think the simplest, most shorthand way of putting it was that Johnson and Labour established parliamentary democracy by holding the government account from the period 1922 to 27. And in particular, at the start of 22, by forcing the holding of the Dáil meeting. The election took place before the Civil War, and the Dáil didn't meet until September. And that was only held then because of pressure from Johnson and his colleagues in Labour. Labour in the period 22 to 27 acted as the official opposition because obviously there was boycotting of the Dáil by the anti-treaty forces. And they in effect would have pursued and advocated a social democratic alternative to the Cumann na Gael approach to government. There were ebbs and flows in the position of Labour during that time, but by the time of the 1927 general election, Labour's fortunes were on the up, and they gained 7 seats to secure 22 seats. Fianna Fáil won 44, and Cumann na Gael lost 13 seats, being reduced to 47. And after Kevin O'Higgins' assassination, Fianna Fáil entered the Dáil and took the oath, which I'll deal with again later on. That changed the dynamics of the parliamentary arithmetic, and emotion of no confidence in the Cumann na Gael government was moved, and the vote was tied and as a result of that, the Cumann na Gael government survived. If the motion of no confidence had passed, there would have been a coalition government led by the Labour Party and supported by Fianna Fáil from the opposition benches, with a commitment by Fianna Fáil that they would have supported that government for the duration of the Parliament. One interesting further aside in the tied vote, TJ O'Connell, who was one of the Labour TDs, missed the vote because he was away in Canada. And when there was a subsequent general election after that kind of narrow shave for Cumann na Gael, Johnson lost his seat and TJ O'Connell became the next leader of the Labour Party in the Dáil. Afterwards, Johnson, he never ran for the Dáil again, but he was elected as senator in 1928, serving in the Shannon until it was abolished in 1936. And he also was actively involved in the separation of the Irish Trade Union Congress from the Labour Party, and continued an active and leadership role in both organisations, attending, for example, the executive meetings of both organisations from then on. He was appointed by the government to a housing commission in the 1930s, fulfilling a long-term Labour demand of active local authority involvement in house building programme, and the National Housing Commission was effectively a body to monitor and cajole local authorities into fulfilling the government mandate for widespread local authority housing delivery. Subsequently, Johnson was appointed a member of the Labour Court when it was established in 1946, serving for 10 years. And in fact, when Johnson finally stood down and retired from public life in 1956, his colleague, who was chairman of the Labour Court, Mortished, made an interesting speech to mark the occasion. And he said one of the craft unions had said to him that Johnson was a saint. Even though he was a Protestant saint, he was still a saint for his advocacy for workers on the Labour Court. And finally, you'll see there that Johnson died in 1963. And just a point about the photograph of his headstone that's on the screen there. That headstone was recently, and grave was recently restored, thanks to a donation both from the Forza Trade Union and SIPTU. And I think you'll all agree, a very, very fine job was done on that. And the grave is in the Clontarf Church of Ireland graveyard, which is behind Clontarf Castle, and is certainly worth a visit by anybody who has an interest in these matters. So, okay, just a couple of, I suppose, to give a flavour of Johnson, I just want to draw your attention to 4 speeches and a letter to Ernest Blythe, and they cover the 1916 conference, the oath, the Civil War executions, the 1927 general election, and his perspective on partition. Now, these screens are heavy on text, so don't trouble yourself trying to read them. This talk has been recorded and will be available on the Labour History Society, and you'll be able to study it in your own time, or indeed the contents of this are available in the book Seeking No Honours. So first of all, with regard to the 1916 Congress, he said that it was his sad duty to say a word or two regarding the loss that we in the working class movement have sustained through the death of those of our comrades whose lives were sacrificed in the recent rebellion, and that's specifically talking about Connolly, Richard O'Carroll, Peter Mackin, and so on. He went on to say that this isn't the place to enter into a discussion as to the right or folly of the revolt, but this we may say, that those amongst the rebels who have been associated with us in the past, who've led and inspired some of us with the love of their country and their class, resolved to act as they did with no selfish thought, but purely with a passion for freedom and a hatred of oppression. And he went on to pay tribute to the many others, including former delegates to previous congresses, who had laid down their lives in another field for what they believed to be the cause of liberty and democracy and love of their country. And in that he was referring to those who were killed in a British Army uniform in the First World War. And like obviously this speech is probably one of the more memorable ones by Johnson, but what you have to recall is that the Congress at that time, the greatest single concentration of trade unionists in the country was in the Greater Belfast area. And the predominant religion of those trade unionists was Protestant, and the predominant politics was generally pro-union. Obviously, there's exceptions to that. So Johnson was speaking to a Congress that would have, let's say, diverse cultural and political backgrounds. And he led that, let's say, balancing act between paying honour to those who died in 1916 and those who died in the Great War. He went on, as I said earlier on, to refer to the Great War as the monstrous offspring of greed and tyranny. And he also indicated that while he was denouncing the leadership of the warring nations, if push came to shove, he still favoured an Allied victory on the grounds that that would enhance democracy as opposed to victory by the other side. He went on to deal with, I suppose, some more kind of socio-economic issues, that the national credit funding the war should continue after the war to support social programmes, that the war measures had validated long-standing labour demands for control of transport, regulation of prices and rents, and that legislation would have been opposed by business in the past if there had been moves to enact it. Workers after the war would need the right to obtain useful employment, doing useful work. And he concluded by calling for steps to an organisation to represent trade union and labour interests, enlisting individual enthusiasts and launching a weekly paper. So his vision at that stage was, in effect, where was labour and society going to be after the war? As you saw, Johnson and Labour participated in the Free State Parliament after the 1922 election. And interestingly, Johnson made a detailed speech at the commencement of that Parliament on the question of the oath. And given that to a large extent the Civil War was fought on the question of the oath, his remarks are interesting for anybody, I suppose, interested in the migration of republicanism from Sinn Féin to Fianna Fáil, and Fianna Fáil entering the Parliament in 1927. He said, "We recognise the act of taking the oath is a formality." I wonder where Dev got those words. "We are giving effect to the will of the organised workers that we should, through our election, endeavour to influence the laws and administration thereof, in such manner as will lighten the burden of the poor, remove the evils of unemployment, bring to realisation the ideals of justice and liberty, and finally lead to the dethronement of capitalism. The terms of the treaty are accepted by us as they are accepted by the people generally under protest." And he went on to say that the declaration of or oath of allegiance was with the proviso that if at any time it shall be deemed wise and expedient by the people of Ireland in the exercise of their sovereign right to denounce the treaty or alter or amend the constitution in any respect whatsoever, nothing in our declaration of allegiance shall be a barrier to our freedom of action. And I just emphasize the significance of that particular speech, given the trajectory of and procrastination of Dev and the Republican movement in taking a further 5 years to come to, in effect, the same conclusion. Just an interesting point as well, and just to make one point about his attitude to the oath. His opposition to the oath was primarily from a Republican, not from a nationalist critique. This extract says, he said, "The king represented an idea in society that one person or one family was above all others, entitled to draw upon the obeisance of all those people called his subjects." So in other words, this wasn't just objection to a British king, it was an objection to royalty. And it is interesting in the whole debate about the oath that was one of the few pure Republican contributions on the subject. Clearly, the 1922 Dáil dealt with terrible matters, and one of them was the assassination of a TD, Sean Hales, by Republican forces, and the attempted assassination of one of his colleagues, and subsequently the execution in Mountjoy of 4 Republican leaders. And Johnson's view was that the assassination of Hales was a horrible, dastardly thing, bloody and unnatural. So he denounced that without any equivocation. He went on then to hold the government to account for the criminal killing of the Republican leaders. He pointed out that they have been in your charge for 5
You're still there, Shay?
Am I still there? Yeah, my camera has kind of, something has happened. I'll keep going anyway. That the people in Mountjoy had been in their charge for 5 months. The government was charged with the care of them. That was their duty as guardians of the law. He said you could have charged them with an offence, but you held them as a defence, and you thought it well not to try them and not to bring them to the courts. And because a man is assassinated who is held in honour, the government of this country, the government of Sir Stott Éireann, announces apparently with pride that they've taken out 4 men who are in their charge as prisoners, and as a reprisal for that assassination, murdered them. That was an extraordinarily powerful speech. Sorry, just give me a moment here. I seem to have lost my screen.
If you press slideshow at the top, you'll get it back again from current slide.
No, I've lost the whole thing. I think it's a problem on my screen.
I can see them, but so long as I'm sure
okay,
I can't do it.
I'm back for whatever was happening there.
Right.
Okay, he went on to say that we felt it necessary she would raise a protest and a warning against secret trials. We feared the possibility that secrecy in the guise of legality would lead to secrecy without legality. There is not even the trial guaranteed under the rules. The offence these men committed was an offence committed before July. In other words, the events in the forecourts. So far as we know, there's been no trial. They were executed as a reprisal. How true it seems that one side in a fight takes upon itself the evils taught by the other side. Johnson then, interestingly, in the 1927, the first election of 1927, which was the first time Fianna Fáil as a political party fought the election, albeit in that election they were still pursuing an abstentionist policy. And he made the point that Fianna Fáil has published an economic programme, the greater part of which is similar to the programme of the Labour Party. If the Labour Party deputies enter the Dáil, Labour will join with them in getting that programme translated into actual fact. So too of any other party which promotes legislation in harmony with the Labour programme. It will have Labour support. And he went on to say, the country has gone through a revolution. Every successful revolution ends in a constitution, and after every revolution, the minority remains dissatisfied with the constitution that is the outcome of the revolution. So it is with us. But no country can become strong and healthy on a diet of revolutions. A revolution, he said, is an emetic, not a food. And I think this is the final quotation, or no, second last one. He opposed Fianna Fáil trying to raise the question of the oath as the sole issue in the election. He said the Labour Party declines to accept this question as the dominant issue. We are trying to induce the people to give attention to social and economic problems. The probable effect of forcing the oath question into the forefront of politics would be to give the existing government a new lease of power, enabling them to continue in their work of lowering wages, cutting pensions, limiting unemployment insurances, widening the gulf between the North and the South by repealing the ameliorative legislation passed for the benefit of the workers, which was carried over from the British regime. Just to make a point about that, Johnson was a constant critique of the rolling back of progressive British legislation in the Free State, where he saw that the ability to reach out to northern workers was being eroded by the fact that they were finding, because they continued to be the beneficiaries of British social legislation that were being lost in the South, that was copper fastening partition. I'll go on then to Johnson on partition before concluding. Johnson was a critique of partition from it first being mooted in 1912. However, by the 1940s, and he drew an interesting distinction in correspondence with Ernest Blythe, who of course was also a Protestant. And he recognized in the North the loyalty of many Protestant workers was to the Crown and British ways. And he drew a firm distinction between Orange bigotry and legitimate concerns and political choices by many in the Protestant churches. And he wrote that he had held the view that Protestants, including Ulster Protestants, had nothing to fear from a Catholic majority's influence on an Irish government. But by the 1940s, he had a more critical stance, writing that I think even now that my arguments were then sound, that there was a strong spirit of independence in civic affairs amongst laymen, ready to spring out when events called it forth. I am not sure the same is true today. And in that he was commenting on, I suppose, the erosion of a kind of a secular approach within the labour and trade union movement, and the erosion of, I suppose, independent-minded Catholics who would have been willing to stand up to clerical dominance in circumstances against the, I suppose, evangelical revival of Catholicism in the 30s and 40s, leaving Johnson, I suppose, in a much more pessimistic place about the future of unification or reunification. So in conclusion, I contend that it's important to see Johnson is a national as well as a trade union and labour figure. He helped underpin parliamentary democracy at its most vulnerable point. He facilitated the integration of the anti-treaty electorate and its representatives into a functioning parliament. He maintained the unity of the trade union movement through World War I, 1916, and the independence struggle, including partition. His views are representative of and central to the approach of Labour and Congress over the century. And he deserves to be recognised alongside the heroic icons from 1913 and 1916 as a formative and lasting influence on the trade union and labour movement since then. In conclusion, I just again draw your attention to seeking no honours, and to point out, apart from my own contribution, there's two important responses from Congress in the pen of Pádraig Yates and from the Labour Party from Brendan Howlin. As I mentioned before, Charlie Callan's detailed piece on Mary Johnson is well worth a read. It reprints Cathal O'Shannon's obituary of Johnson following his death. And again, as I mentioned previously, Pádraig Yates' account of the drafting and editing of the democratic programme is contained in the book. So with that, I'll conclude, Mary, and hand it over to you for comments or questions.
Thanks, Shay. That was fantastically comprehensive and actually very convincing. I wouldn't have been a fan of Johnson before. What we're going to do now is use the chat button for questions or comments. The Q&A button appears to have disappeared from Zoom, so But just if you have any particular questions, Kevin has posted where you can buy this excellent book. Jim Quinn he has a comment here. According to the 1925 executive report, Tom Johnson visited Enniskillen and Clones and other locations during the autumn/winter of 1924 to discuss the situation in the 6 counties. Are these meetings likely to be detailed in his diaries and papers? That is the names of those he met. And having visited Enniskillen, Clones and other locations during the autumn/winter of 1924, and are they mentioned in the diaries and the papers, the names of people he met?
No, the only thing I read was a report, which obviously was a report to the Congress Executive, in effect stating that they met with extremely mixed views, and that there was considerable demoralisation about the future of political Labour in the 6 counties. Remember, you see, this was before the Boundary Commission kind of had reported, so there would be an uncertainty about the future shape of the 6 counties, whether it was going to be 4 counties or whatever. But even though the trade union movement remained intact on a north-south 32-county basis, Labour, in effect, in the north had become extremely marginalised, particularly following the abolition of PR by the Stormont regime.
Right, and again on the subject of Labour, but the modern Labour Party, Deirdre's wondering, given the current leadership succession stakes, could you comment on whether O'Brien's ITGWU and his opposition to Mortished's Senate nomination after Johnson lost his Dáil seat in the 1927 general election really was a stab in the back to Johnson, because Mortished was viewed as his protege. And she said, although it undermined income support to the Irish Labour Party and TUC Secretariat.
Yeah, I think that was the first kind of public manifestation of O'Brien's kind of primacy of the ITGWU over the Labour movement. And like O'Brien wanted to secure Shannon seats for the Transport Union, and let's say at the expense of what I might call political Labour. And obviously that was a tendency that repeated through the 30s and 40s. So that was Johnson's first engagement with it. Johnson had been quite close to O'Brien at an earlier stage and relied on him quite a lot in the 1922 Dáil and indeed in the 1927 Dáil, the first one. But clearly they migrated in different directions. And interestingly, when the Congress and the Labour Party split in the 40s, Johnson was on the anti-O'Brien side in both of those splits, albeit that he never personalised the split or made it worse through, I suppose, bitter attacks on opponents.
Okay, Port Yates congratulates you on an excellent analysis, an important analysis of Johnson's political development and his importance in the development of the Irish Labour movement. And I'm sure everybody else probably thought so as well in the audience. John Feely thought it was an excellent presentation and a great read, and he wondered, was Senator Bobby Burke of Tuam close to Johnson?
I'm not aware. I decided I put a caveat at the start of the book that it wasn't my intention to have a detailed account of his life on the grounds that I was only aiming to do 50 pages and it became 75. So I didn't track his life in the Shannon to any great extent, so I couldn't give an informed view as to who his colleagues were, except that the impression you got from lots of correspondence was that he had some close, intimate friends, particularly over time, young Jim Larkin. Ironically, given that young Jim Larkin was the cause of losing his Dáil seat in 1927, and that he was kind of he was well regarded by all his colleagues in both the Dáil and in the Shannon, as was shown in later life. Maybe just to make a point, Johnson had been, I suppose, in receipt of decent income for all his working career, but he had the misfortune, both himself and Mary, of living too long, and their savings had gone. So there was a number of people from Congress, young Jim Larkin and Barry Desmond, visited him in his home in the late 50s to discover that they had really fallen on hard times, and went to Jean Lemasse via the Congress. And Lemasse arranged in effect, a War of Independence pension for him, and without any equivocation or anything. And then when Tom died, Mary lived on for a further 7 or 8 years. And again, she fell into very, very difficult times. And Frank Robbins approached Jack Lynch, who was TD at the time, to see if something could be done. And Lynch sent a note to the Minister for Finance, Charlie Haughey, to find some way of fixing it. And Charlie Haughey found that Johnson had waived a lot of his salary in the 30s because he was both a senator and a member of the Housing Commission. So Haughey treated that as a gift to the state, which the state was then returning to the family. And Mary wrote thanking him, saying that, you know, you're doing this for the widow of an old patriot, even though we are not of your party. And I just think the fact that so speedily all of those responded to the financial position of the journalists indicated the kind of interpersonal relationships that they'd built up over the years.
Yeah. He's obviously respected, as well as, you know, that it wasn't being held against him that he didn't agree with them. Emmett O'Connor wants to know, he said in 1920, the Labour Party and TUC invited Davy Campbell to become Secretary of Congress. Did Johnson want to change jobs at that time?
Yes. Now, I only kind of came across this. First of all, Davy Campbell was a very, very close friend of Johnson. They had obviously come through the trade union movement in Belfast. Davy Campbell actually accompanied John and Mary in the period in 1913 when they were fundraising. So the intention of appointing Davy Campbell wasn't kind of undermining Johnson. I think Johnson was going in the political direction, and I think that's kind of what was going on there. Again, I didn't delve too deeply into it, but that was the impression I had.
That leads nicely into Kevin's question, which is wondering why Johnson never ran for the Dáil again after the September 27 election.
I suspect it was due to the fact that, and in fact he wrote about this, he had been criticised by many people for being an Englishman. And in particular, the cheerleader of all of that, ironically, was the man who grew up a few streets from him, Jim Larkin, who seems to have forgotten entirely that he was born in England. But Johnson said he'd put up with it for a period of time, but the vehemence of it in or around 1927, when he literally came within one seat of being, as we would know now, the Taoiseach, and that this had taken currency amongst people that he respected. I think he just decided he was not a man for the front line of politics. In addition, I think he had formed the view that his, I suppose, quiet, collegiate approach to things was not suitable for a party political leader. And I think he probably found the Shannon a more congenial place than you know, the back of a truck outside a church on Sundays. But certainly the accusation and taunting of him for being an Englishman, I think hit him badly and hit him deeply.
There's a really interesting, very short Pathé presentation on the IFI website showing him in 1922 for the general strike against militarism. And he looks like, you know, from the back of a truck, that he's trying to do the Larkin kind of thing and looks extremely uncomfortable. Unfortunately, it's silent, so I couldn't make out what he was saying, but it kind of is in keeping with him being always seen as a very decent man and one of principle. That's all the questions we had, but there are certainly lots of congratulations and on an excellent presentation. And Shame about the little bit of a hiccup with the technicalities, but one of these days we'll get it right totally and have it all smooth. Deirdre said special thanks for responses highlighting a modest collegial man without any embittered reaction to amazingly vehement slights from all sides.
Mary, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course. I hang on a sec. Go ahead. I can't see it. Yeah.
Dennis Landy here in Carrick-on-Shore. And Shay, thanks very much for a fantastic presentation. You pricked my ears when you mentioned a doctor from Carrick-on-Shore. And before you might know, I suspect it's Dr. Murphy, who was very active. Yeah. Also, just to say when we're on that, it's funny how every piece of information you gather, William O'Brien actually spent some of his time in Carrick-on-Shore as a young man. His father was an RUC man in the town. So I'm sure he came across Dr. Murphy in his time in Carrick-on-Shore without knowing it. So just add in that little one. But I suspect it was Dr. Murphy. He was very active, yeah.
No, it was, and it was his witness statement describes him bringing the £2,000, which was an incredible amount of money to come out of a town like that in support of the rail and dock workers in the munitions dispute.
Okay, well,
thanks very much, Shay. Thank you. Thanks, Mary.
Just thanks everybody and for the excellent contributions. Next Thursday at 7 o'clock, we've got Alan McCarthy, who is going to give a presentation about workers' education in Cork versus Dublin and the People's College. Fionnuala Richardson will be chairing that one. And so Kevin has already circulated the link, but if you haven't got it already, you know where to reach him to pick it up. Or actually, I think it might be booking through Eventbrite too. But again, thank you very much, Shay, in your different capacity this afternoon. And I urge everybody to get the book. It's a lovely production. It looks great, even though I haven't actually got to read more than just skim for the moment. Thanks very much, everybody, and hope we'll see you next Thursday as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.